Some promises wait so long to be kept that only the faithful still remember where they were left. The first snowfall had buried nearly every trail leading into the northern Pennsylvania forest, turning familiar paths into endless fields of untouched white. Pine branches bent beneath heavy blankets of fresh snow, and the silence felt so complete that even the distant call of a raven seemed to disappear before reaching the frozen valley below. Daniel Brooks pulled his weathered truck onto the narrow roadside and stared toward the abandoned hunting cabin that stood alone among towering evergreens. He had driven this route every winter since retiring from the United States Marine Corps, checking isolated properties for neighbors who could no longer manage the deep snow themselves. Nothing about the old cabin had changed in years. Its faded cedar walls leaned gently beneath the weight of winter. The stone chimney wore a thick crown of snow. Frost covered every window until they looked like pale mirrors reflecting nothing back. Yet something was different today. Ranger was already there. The 7-year-old German shepherd sat perfectly still in front of the cabin door, snow collecting across his broad shoulders without the slightest attempt to shake it away. His alert ears pointed toward the silent building, while his intelligent amber eyes remained fixed upon the weathered wooden entrance, as though waiting for someone who had promised to return. Daniel stepped from the truck, his boots sinking nearly 8 inches into fresh powder with every careful step. Cold mountain air filled his lungs, carrying the clean scent of pine needles, frozen earth, and distant wood smoke drifting from farms miles away. He smiled softly as he called out, "Come on, Ranger. Time to head home." Normally, the loyal German shepherd would turn immediately, wag his tail once, and trot proudly back toward the truck. This morning he did not move. His gaze never left the cabin. Daniel walked closer, brushing loose snow from the thick black and tan coat covering Ranger's back. The dog briefly looked up at him with calm, searching eyes before quietly returning his attention toward the silent doorway. There was no fear in his expression, no aggression, only quiet determination unlike anything Daniel had ever witnessed during the many years they had spent together. Ranger had followed him through storms, mountain trails, lonely highways, and peaceful farms without hesitation. Today was the first time he had refused a command. Daniel crouched beside him, resting one gloved hand gently against the dog's neck. "What are you trying to tell me, old friend?" The German shepherd slowly stood and walked only a few feet toward the cabin steps before sitting down once again in exactly the same position. Snowflakes continued drifting across the clearing, settling silently around them until fresh white covered their footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. Daniel glanced toward the untouched forest surrounding the cabin. There were no vehicle tracks. No smoke rose from the chimney. No lights glowed behind the frozen windows. Everything suggested the building had remained empty throughout the winter. Yet Ranger behaved as though someone inside still needed him. Nearly 20 minutes passed beneath the falling snow. Daniel offered food from his backpack, fresh water from an insulated bottle, and every familiar encouragement the faithful dog had always answered before. Ranger accepted neither. He simply remained watching the cabin with unwavering patience. As pale afternoon light slowly faded behind thick winter clouds, Daniel realized this was no ordinary act of stubbornness. Somewhere beneath the endless silence covering the forgotten cabin rested a reason strong enough to hold the unwavering loyalty of the one companion who had never before refused to walk beside him. Daniel Brooks remained beside Ranger until the gray winter afternoon slowly surrendered to early evening. Snow continued falling in slow, silent waves, softening every sharp edge around the forgotten cabin until the entire clearing looked as though it had been wrapped inside a white blanket. He had never known the loyal German shepherd to ignore a direct command. During years of living together, Ranger had followed him through crowded streets, remote hiking trails, and powerful snowstorms, without hesitation. Yet today the faithful dog behaved as though leaving the cabin would mean abandoning something far more important than comfort or obedience. Daniel finally clipped the leash onto Ranger's collar, speaking with the calm voice that had always earned complete trust. "Come on, partner. We will come back tomorrow." Ranger stood without resistance, took only 3 slow steps toward the truck, then quietly stopped. He looked back toward the cabin, his ears lifting once more. Daniel gently encouraged him forward, but the German shepherd lowered his body and calmly refused to continue. There was no struggle, no panic, only quiet determination that seemed impossible to explain. Daniel sighed softly before unclipping the leash again. The moment the collar became free, Ranger returned to his original place beside the cabin door and sat exactly where he had been before. His posture relaxed immediately, as though he believed he had returned to where he belonged. Daniel studied the untouched snow surrounding the clearing. Only 2 sets of tracks disturbed the fresh powder. His own boot prints and Ranger's paw prints stretched from the truck directly to the cabin. No other footprints crossed the snow. No signs suggested anyone had entered or left the building for several days. Even the thick layer of snow resting upon the front steps remained almost perfectly smooth except where Ranger now sat watching the weathered door. Curious uneasiness settled quietly inside Daniel's thoughts. He climbed the 3 wooden steps and carefully tested the cabin door. It remained unlocked. The old hinges groaned softly as he pushed it open, releasing the cool scent of aged pine, dry cedar, and stone that had rested untouched through many winters. Pale evening light entered through frost-covered windows, revealing a single room filled with worn furniture hidden beneath white dust sheets. An iron stove stood cold beside a stone fireplace. A wooden rocking chair rested near the window, facing the forest. Shelves lined one wall, nearly empty except for a cracked lantern and several forgotten books. Everything appeared frozen in time, yet strangely undisturbed. Daniel slowly walked across the creaking floorboards, shining his flashlight into every corner. No broken windows, no recent footprints inside, no signs that anyone had sought shelter there during the storm. He turned back toward the open doorway where Ranger remained sitting outside. The German shepherd did not even glance at Daniel. His attention remained fixed upon the cabin interior, almost as though waiting for his owner to notice something hidden in plain sight. Daniel stepped back outside and knelt beside him once again. Snow had gathered across Ranger's muzzle and shoulders, but the faithful dog seemed completely unaware of the bitter cold. Daniel gently brushed the snow away with one gloved hand before wrapping his own heavy wool scarf loosely around the dog's neck for extra warmth. Ranger accepted the kindness with one brief look of gratitude before quietly facing the cabin again. Twilight settled across the forest, turning the snow pale blue beneath the fading sky. Daniel looked once more at the lonely cabin standing silent among towering pines and made a decision that surprised even himself. If Ranger believed something inside that forgotten place still mattered, then he would return at first light and search every inch of the cabin until he understood why the most loyal companion he had ever known refused to walk away. The following morning arrived wrapped in silence, so complete that every sound seemed to linger beneath the heavy winter sky. Fresh snow had fallen throughout the night, covering the previous day's footprints until the forest looked untouched once again. Daniel Brooks parked his truck beside the narrow road before lifting his backpack over one shoulder. Ranger stepped down beside him immediately and, without waiting for a command, started toward the lonely cabin with calm confidence. The German shepherd did not rush. He simply walked with quiet purpose, his broad paws leaving the first trail through nearly 10 inches of fresh powder. Daniel followed close behind, breathing in the crisp mountain air scented with pine resin, clean snow, and the faint trace of frozen cedar drifting from the old cabin ahead. As they reached the clearing, pale morning sunlight filtered through tall, evergreen branches, scattering soft beams across the snow like ribbons of silver. Ranger climbed the weathered wooden steps and paused beside the open doorway exactly where Daniel had left it the evening before. His ears lifted slightly. His eyes remained fixed inside the cabin. Daniel slowly entered once again, carrying a powerful flashlight despite the growing daylight. Dust floated gently through narrow rays of winter sun breaking across the old wooden floor. Every object remained exactly where he had seen it yesterday. The rocking chair stood quietly beside the frosted window. The iron stove rested cold beneath a thin layer of dust. A faded wool blanket still covered one corner of the narrow bed. Nothing suggested that anyone had entered the cabin for years. Ranger finally crossed the doorway and moved slowly through the room. Unlike an excited search dog, he showed remarkable patience. He sniffed neither furniture nor walls. Instead, he walked directly toward the large stone fireplace built along the back wall of the cabin. There he stopped, lowered his head, and quietly stared at the wide stone hearth. Daniel watched carefully. Ranger remained perfectly still for several seconds before taking one deliberate step to the left. He gently touched a single worn floorboard with one front paw, not scratching wildly, not digging, simply pressing it once before lifting his paw and looking back toward Daniel. The veteran felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He knelt beside the weathered floorboard and brushed away years of settled dust with one gloved hand. At first glance, the wooden planks appeared identical, worn smooth by countless footsteps long forgotten. Then he noticed something unusual. One narrow board carried faint tool marks unlike the others, and the tiny gap surrounding its edges appeared almost perfectly straight. Someone had measured it carefully. Daniel ran his fingertips across the wood. It felt slightly looser than the surrounding floorboards. Ranger quietly sat beside him without making a sound. The German shepherd's steady breathing filled the silent cabin while outside a gentle breeze carried loose snow from the pine branches onto the roof above. Daniel opened his backpack and removed a compact pry bar he always carried while repairing fences around neighboring farms. He hesitated for only a moment before carefully sliding the thin metal edge into the narrow seam beside the unusual board. He applied slow, steady pressure, determined not to damage whatever might lie beneath. The old wood answered with a soft creak before lifting only a fraction of an inch. Daniel stopped immediately. Beneath the opening, hidden below decades of dust and carefully fitted timber, rested complete darkness. He slowly raised the flashlight toward the narrow gap. The beam revealed the edge of something smooth and carefully crafted resting inside a concealed compartment beneath the cabin floor. Ranger quietly lowered his head beside Daniel's shoulder, his amber eyes reflecting the pale light, as though he had been waiting not for a discovery, but for someone willing to finally see what had been hidden there all along. Daniel Brooks remained kneeling beside the loosened floorboard for several long moments, allowing the silence inside the old cabin to settle before continuing. Snow drifted softly against the frosted windows, and the slow whisper of winter wind moving through towering pine trees became the only sound beyond Ranger's calm breathing. The faithful German shepherd did not move. His amber eyes remained fixed upon the narrow opening beneath the weathered wooden floor, as though he had patiently guarded this forgotten place until the right person finally arrived. Daniel carefully slid the pry bar farther beneath the board and applied slow, even pressure. The aged plank lifted another few inches before releasing completely with a deep wooden sigh. He gently set it aside, revealing a rectangular compartment built with remarkable precision beneath the cabin floor. Whoever had created the hidden space had measured every piece by hand. The walls were lined with cedar boards that had preserved the contents despite countless winters. Daniel lowered his flashlight into the opening. Resting inside lay a beautifully crafted cedar chest wrapped carefully in faded canvas and tied with thick leather straps darkened by age. There were no signs of damage, no moisture, no decay. It looked as though someone had hidden it only yesterday instead of decades ago. Daniel removed his heavy gloves before reaching into the compartment. The chest felt surprisingly solid as he slowly lifted it onto the cabin floor. Ranger quietly stood beside him, watching every movement without making a sound. Snowflakes clung to the thick fur around his neck, where Daniel's wool scarf still rested from the previous evening. The veteran brushed a layer of dust from the lid, revealing delicate hand-carved initials. HM. Beneath them another line had been carved with extraordinary care. For the day truth finds its way home. Daniel quietly repeated the words under his breath. They carried the weight of someone who had believed that time alone could not bury the things that mattered most. He slowly released the worn leather straps before lifting the lid. The rich scent of aged cedar escaped into the cold cabin, mixing with the fragrance of pine and fresh snow drifting through the open doorway. Folded neatly at the very top rested a carefully preserved American flag wrapped inside protective cloth. Beneath it lay a military medal inside its original presentation case, polished so carefully before being stored that it still reflected the pale winter light. Beside the medal rested several faded family photographs protected inside clear waterproof sleeves. Daniel picked up the first photograph with great care. It showed a smiling man standing outside the very same cabin many years earlier beside a young girl no older than 7 and a magnificent German shepherd wearing an old leather collar. The little girl laughed as she hugged the faithful dog while snow covered the surrounding forest just as it did today. Daniel looked toward Ranger. For one quiet moment, the similarities between the two German shepherds felt almost impossible to ignore. Beneath the photographs rested a thick leather journal wrapped inside oilcloth together with a sealed envelope addressed simply to My Little Grace. Daniel felt an unexpected heaviness settle inside his chest. He carefully placed the envelope beside the journal without breaking the fragile seal. At the bottom of the cedar chest rested one final object. It was an old county property map folded around a handwritten note. The ink had faded slightly, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. If anyone finds this, please ask Eleanor Mitchell what truly happened before believing what the town remembers. Ranger slowly lowered himself beside the cedar chest and rested one gentle paw against its worn wooden edge. His long, silent vigil had finally revealed its purpose, yet the greatest mystery had only just begun. Daniel Brooks carried the cedar chest back to his farmhouse just before another wave of snow swept across the mountains, determined to protect everything inside before the weather grew worse. Ranger walked quietly beside him through the white landscape, his steady pace completely different from the restless determination that had kept him at the cabin for so many days. The German shepherd no longer looked toward the forest behind them. Instead, he remained close to Daniel, as though trusting that the journey hidden beneath the cabin floor had finally begun moving in the right direction. Inside the farmhouse, warm firelight flickered gently across rough pine walls while the scent of burning oak logs mixed with fresh coffee and melting snow drying from heavy boots. Daniel carefully placed the cedar chest upon the old kitchen table, spreading a clean wool blanket beneath it before removing the leather journal from its protective wrapping. Ranger settled near the stone fireplace, but never completely closed his eyes. Every few moments he quietly looked toward the journal resting beneath the warm light. Daniel slowly opened the worn leather cover. The first page carried a carefully written name, Henry Mitchell. Beneath it appeared another sentence written with remarkable precision. If these pages are ever opened, please let my daughter know that I never stopped looking for my way back to her. Daniel remained motionless for several seconds before turning to the next page. The earliest entries described simple days filled with gratitude rather than hardship. Henry wrote about building the small cabin by hand after returning from military service, cutting each log himself, shaping every beam with patient determination, and planting tall pine saplings around the clearing so his little daughter could someday watch them grow. He often mentioned their loyal German shepherd, Dakota, who followed Grace everywhere across the snowy hills and never allowed the little girl to wander alone. Every page painted the picture of a peaceful family living quietly in the mountains, far from noise and crowded towns. As Daniel continued reading, the tone gradually shifted. A series of unusually harsh winters damaged nearby farms. Roads frequently closed beneath deep snow, and work became increasingly difficult to find. Henry wrote that he accepted temporary construction jobs several counties away so Grace and her mother would never worry about food or warmth. He promised himself that every absence would be brief. One evening entry ended with a single sentence that seemed to carry unbearable weight. I pray she remembers every goodbye as a promise to return, never as a farewell. Daniel quietly turned another page. Several entries later, he discovered the reason the cedar chest had been hidden beneath the cabin floor. Henry described receiving devastating medical news during one winter while working far from home. Believing he had little time left and fearing his family would lose both the cabin and every memory it contained, he carefully gathered the military medal, family photographs, property records, personal journal, and one final letter written to Grace. He sealed everything inside the cedar chest and concealed it beneath the floor before leaving to seek treatment, convinced he would return once he recovered. His final completed journal entry carried neither anger nor fear. It carried hope. If I do not make it home when I planned, tell Grace that every sunrise found me trying. Tell her I loved her enough to leave behind proof instead of excuses. Daniel slowly closed the journal as emotion settled quietly over the room. Ranger rose from beside the fireplace and rested his head gently against Daniel's knee. The veteran looked toward the sealed envelope addressed to Grace. Mitchell, still untouched after all these years. Then his eyes returned to the handwritten note resting beside the property map. Only one person, Eleanor Mitchell, could explain everything the journal had not been able to finish. The next morning dawned beneath a sky the color of polished steel, and fresh snow sparkled across the Pennsylvania mountains as though the entire forest had been quietly washed clean overnight. Daniel Brooks carefully wrapped the leather journal, the sealed letter addressed to Grace, and the handwritten note inside a waterproof canvas satchel before placing them gently on the passenger seat of his old truck. The cedar chest remained safely inside the farmhouse, protected from the cold until its rightful family could decide its future. Ranger climbed into the truck beside him without hesitation. For the first time since discovering the hidden compartment beneath the cabin floor, the German Shepherd appeared completely at ease. His ears rested naturally, and his steady breathing carried none of the quiet urgency that had first drawn Daniel into the frozen forest. According to several longtime neighbors, Eleanor Mitchell still lived nearly 20 miles away in a small farmhouse overlooking the river valley where she had spent almost her entire life. Daniel drove slowly along snow-covered back roads bordered by white fences, frozen streams, and towering pine forests that disappeared into distant hills beneath low winter clouds. The peaceful silence inside the truck was broken only by the gentle sound of the heater and the occasional crunch of packed snow beneath the tires. Shortly before noon, they turned onto a narrow gravel driveway leading toward a modest white farmhouse surrounded by old maple trees whose bare branches stretched into the pale winter sky. Thin smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney, carrying the comforting scent of burning oak across the crisp mountain air. Before Daniel reached the porch steps, the front door quietly opened. An elderly woman with silver hair neatly tied behind her head stepped outside, wearing a thick wool sweater beneath a warm blue coat. Her kind gray eyes settled first upon Daniel before slowly moving toward Ranger. The moment she saw the German Shepherd, her expression changed completely. A quiet smile appeared, followed almost instantly by tears she made no attempt to hide. She slowly knelt despite the snow and gently reached toward Ranger with trembling hands. The faithful dog walked forward without fear, lowered his head, and rested it softly against her shoulder as though greeting someone he had known forever. Eleanor closed her eyes for several silent moments while gently stroking the thick black and tan fur around his neck. "He looks so much like Dakota," she whispered. "I never thought I would see eyes like those again." Daniel introduced himself and carefully explained everything that had happened since Ranger first refused to leave the snow-covered cabin. He described the hidden compartment beneath the floor, the cedar chest, the journal, the family photographs, and finally the sealed letter addressed to Grace Mitchell. Eleanor listened quietly without interrupting. When Daniel gently spoke the name Henry Mitchell, she lowered her eyes and slowly nodded. "Henry was my younger brother," she said softly. "The town believed he abandoned his family after leaving for work. Some people even said he never intended to return." She shook her head with quiet sadness. None of that was true. Daniel carefully placed the leather journal upon the kitchen table beside the unopened letter. Eleanor rested one weathered hand upon the worn cover before taking a long, steady breath. "Grace deserves to know everything," she whispered. Late that afternoon, the snow clouds slowly drifted apart, allowing pale winter sunlight to spill across Eleanor Mitchell's quiet farmhouse. The warm glow softened the lines on her face as she carefully opened the leather journal for the first time in more than 4 decades. Her fingertips moved gently across the familiar handwriting, and for a long moment, she simply closed her eyes, breathing in the faint scent of aged paper and cedar that still lingered between its pages. Ranger rested peacefully beside her chair, watching every movement with calm amber eyes, while Daniel Brooks remained respectfully silent across the kitchen table. Some reunions belong to words. Others belonged first to silence. Eleanor finally began speaking in a voice filled with memories rather than regret. She explained that Henry had never intended to leave his family behind. When doctors discovered a serious illness during one of his construction assignments, he chose not to return home immediately because he feared Grace would remember only weakness instead of the strong father who had built her cabin, taught her to fish, and carried her through deep mountain snow. He believed treatment would give him enough time to recover before returning home. Instead, one setback followed another. Letters were delayed, addresses changed, and communication slowly disappeared beneath circumstances neither side could control. While Henry struggled to find his way back, rumors spread through the small mountain town. People whispered that he had abandoned his family. Some claimed he had started a new life somewhere else. Grace was still young enough that repeated silence slowly became the only truth she believed. Eleanor lowered her eyes before continuing. She admitted that she had searched for her brother for years before finally learning that he had passed away far from home. By then the cabin had already been abandoned, and no one knew the cedar chest rested beneath its floor. She never told Grace every detail because she possessed only fragments of the story herself. Without proof, she feared reopening wounds that had never healed. Daniel quietly placed the sealed envelope addressed to Grace beside the journal. Eleanor gently touched it with trembling fingertips before smiling through tears that refused to stop. "He kept his promise after all," she whispered. He left her the truth. She slowly walked to an old writing desk standing beside the frosted window and unlocked the top drawer with a small brass key hanging from a faded blue ribbon. Inside rested carefully bundled Christmas cards tied together with white string. After searching several moments, she removed one final envelope bearing a Vermont return address. "Grace still writes every December," Eleanor said softly. "She always asks whether I have remembered anything more about her father." Daniel accepted the envelope with quiet gratitude. Ranger rose from the wooden floor and walked to the front door, stopping there with relaxed confidence before looking back toward Daniel. The German shepherd no longer seemed restless. Instead, his expression carried peaceful certainty, as though the path ahead had become perfectly clear. Snow continued falling lightly beyond the farmhouse windows, covering the winding roads in fresh white once again. Daniel slipped Grace's address safely into the canvas satchel beside the journal and the unopened letter. As he prepared to leave, Eleanor gently placed one weathered hand upon Ranger's broad shoulder. Dakota waited for Henry every evening until the day he could not wait any longer, she said quietly. Perhaps loyalty has a way of passing from one faithful heart to another. Daniel looked at Ranger standing patiently beside the doorway and realized the journey that had begun beside the lonely cabin was never about uncovering forgotten objects. It had always been about carrying one father's love safely across 40 silent winters until it finally reached the daughter who had never stopped wondering why he never came home. 4 days later, the snowstorm finally gave way to a brilliant blue sky as Daniel Brooks and Ranger crossed the Vermont state line beneath towering pine forests coated with sparkling ice. The long drive had been quiet, filled only with the steady hum of the truck engine and the occasional rustle of the canvas satchel resting safely on the passenger seat. Inside it lay the leather journal, the preserved family photographs, and the sealed letter that had waited more than 40 years to reach the hands for which it had been written. Ranger sat calmly beside Daniel, his amber eyes watching the snowy landscape roll past without the restless urgency that had once held him before the lonely cabin. It was as though every mile carried them closer to the destination he had somehow known existed all along. By early afternoon, they turned onto a peaceful country road lined with white birch trees and old stone fences nearly buried beneath fresh snow. A modest farmhouse stood at the end of the winding driveway, surrounded by bird feeders, evergreen shrubs, and a small red mailbox whose weathered paint had faded with countless winters. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney while sunlight reflected from every snow-covered branch, filling the quiet property with remarkable warmth despite the cold air. Daniel parked the truck and remained seated for one final moment, resting his hand upon the canvas satchel. He understood that some deliveries carried more than paper. They carried entire lifetimes. Ranger stepped quietly onto the snow before Daniel reached the porch. The German shepherd paused only briefly, lifting his nose toward the crisp winter breeze before calmly walking to the front steps. A few seconds later, the front door slowly opened. A woman in her early 50s stood there wrapped in a thick wool sweater beneath a dark winter coat. Silver strands mixed gently through her chestnut hair, and kindness rested naturally within her eyes despite the quiet sadness they seemed to carry. Daniel introduced himself with respectful calm before explaining that he had come from Pennsylvania regarding her father. Grace Mitchell became completely still. She did not interrupt. She simply listened as Daniel briefly described the abandoned cabin, the hidden cedar chest, and the journal discovered beneath the floor. When he carefully removed the sealed envelope bearing her name in Henry Mitchell's familiar handwriting, she covered her mouth with trembling hands. Tears filled her eyes before she spoke a single word. "That is his handwriting," she whispered. Her voice barely rose above the gentle wind moving through the trees. Daniel placed the letter carefully into her hands without opening it. Grace held the envelope against her heart for several long moments, unable to move. Ranger quietly approached and rested beside her without making a sound. She slowly knelt in the snow, gently wrapping one arm around the faithful German shepherd's neck. "You waited for me," she whispered softly, not because she believed Ranger had known her father personally, but because somehow his unwavering loyalty had carried her father's love safely across for silent decades. Inside the warm farmhouse, sunlight poured through wide windows onto polished wooden floors as Grace finally broke the fragile seal. Daniel remained respectfully near the fireplace, while Ranger rested quietly at her feet. Every line she read seemed to erase another year of unanswered questions. Henry did not write excuses. He wrote memories of teaching her to catch snowflakes, building the cabin together, laughing beside Dakota, and promising that every mile he traveled had always been meant to lead back home. By the time she reached the final page, tears flowed freely across her smile. For the first time since childhood, silence no longer sounded like abandonment. It sounded like love that had simply taken far too long to find its way home. Grace Mitchell remained seated beside the wide farmhouse window long after she finished reading her father's letter. Outside, afternoon sunlight shimmered across fresh snow, transforming every field into a quiet sea of light. Inside, the only sound came from the gentle crackle of oak logs burning inside the stone fireplace. The letter rested carefully in her hands, no longer folded shut by unanswered years, but opened at last by truth. Daniel Brooks stood nearby without speaking, understanding that some moments deserved witness rather than interruption. Ranger lay peacefully at Grace's feet, his head resting upon his front paws, his calm amber eyes quietly following every movement in the room. After several minutes, Grace carefully folded the letter exactly as her father had left it and placed it beside the leather journal. She reached for one of the preserved photographs from the cedar chest. It showed a little girl laughing in deep winter snow beside a strong German shepherd, while a smiling father looked toward them with unmistakable pride. Grace smiled through fresh tears. "I remember that day," she whispered. "Dakota kept stealing my mitten because he wanted me to chase him through the snow." She laughed softly for the first time since Daniel had arrived. Father pretended to be upset, but he laughed even harder than I did. Daniel quietly listened as memories slowly returned, not as painful fragments, but as complete moments that had survived beneath years of misunderstanding. Grace explained how she had spent much of her adult life believing she had somehow failed to be important enough for her father to come home. Every birthday, every Christmas, every snowfall had quietly reopened the same unanswered question. Reading the journal and the letter had not erased the lost years, but they had replaced doubt with certainty. Her father had never stopped loving her. He had never stopped trying to return. The burden she had carried since childhood quietly began to disappear. As evening approached, Grace made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked Daniel if he would accompany her back to Pennsylvania. "I want to see the cabin again," she said softly. "Not as the place where I believed my father disappeared, but as the place where he left every piece of himself, hoping one day I would find it." Daniel nodded without hesitation. Ranger slowly stood and walked toward the front door before glancing back at both of them with calm patience. Grace smiled gently. "He already knows where we are going." The following morning, they began the journey together beneath clear winter skies. Snow-covered mountains rolled quietly beyond the highway, while frozen rivers reflected pale sunlight like sheets of polished glass. During the drive, Grace continued reading passages from the journal aloud, sometimes laughing at childhood memories she had nearly forgotten, sometimes growing silent as she discovered new details about her father's hopes, fears, and quiet determination. Daniel noticed that every page seemed to restore another small piece of the family history that had been hidden for so long. Ranger rested comfortably across the back seat, sleeping peacefully for much of the drive, waking only when they crossed into Pennsylvania. As the familiar mountain roads curved toward the forest, He quietly lifted his head and looked through the window. There was no urgency in his expression now, only quiet recognition. The cabin was no longer waiting to reveal its secret. It was waiting to welcome home the daughter whose name had rested faithfully inside a sealed envelope through more than 40 winters until loyalty, patience, and love finally completed the journey together. When Daniel Brooks, Grace Mitchell, and Ranger finally reached the old mountain cabin, the afternoon sun hung low above the snow-covered ridges, filling the frozen clearing with soft golden light that seemed warmer than the winter air itself. Nothing about the cabin had changed since Daniel first found Ranger standing faithfully outside its weathered door, yet everything felt different now. The lonely silence no longer carried unanswered questions. Instead, it welcomed the people who finally understood why this forgotten place had waited so patiently through the passing years. Grace stepped slowly across the untouched snow, her boots leaving careful footprints toward the small wooden porch where she had once played as a little girl. She paused before touching the rough cedar wall with trembling fingertips. Closing her eyes, she allowed memories to return naturally. She remembered helping her father stack firewood beside the stone chimney, watching Dakota chase falling snowflakes across the clearing, and listening to laughter echo through the forest whenever winter storms kept them together inside the warm cabin. Daniel quietly unlocked the front door and stepped aside without saying a word. Grace entered alone while Ranger followed a few steps behind, moving calmly through the familiar room. Sunlight streamed gently through the frosted windows, illuminating tiny dust particles floating above the worn wooden floor. The old rocking chair remained beside the window. The stone fireplace still stood proudly against the back wall. Everything seemed to have waited with extraordinary patience for this very moment. Grace slowly walked toward the place where the hidden compartment had rested beneath the floorboards. She knelt there in silence before resting one hand upon the smooth wood that now covered the opening once again. A peaceful smile replaced the sorrow that had lived within her for so many years. "You really did come home," she whispered softly. "You simply arrived later than either of us expected." Daniel remained respectfully near the doorway while Ranger quietly settled beside Grace, resting his head gently against her shoulder exactly as Dakota once might have done long ago. The simple gesture brought another smile instead of tears. Before leaving the cabin, Grace made one unexpected request. She asked Daniel whether the townspeople who had known her father were still nearby. By early evening, word quietly spread across the small mountain community that something remarkable had been discovered inside the abandoned cabin. Neighbors gathered inside the modest town meeting hall where snow-covered boots lined the entrance and the scent of fresh coffee filled the warm room. Many arrived believing they would simply hear another story about an old property. Instead, Daniel carefully displayed the preserved journal, the family photographs, and the military medal before Grace stood to speak. She did not accuse anyone of believing the wrong story. She simply read several passages written by her father describing his love for his family, his determination to return home, and the hope that one day truth would find its way back even if he could not. As her quiet voice filled the room, every conversation disappeared. Elderly neighbors lowered their eyes. Some remembered repeating the rumors decades earlier without ever questioning whether they were true. Others admitted they had accepted silence as evidence because it seemed easier than waiting for answers. By the time Grace finished reading the final page, many faces were wet with tears that reflected not only sorrow but relief. A good man's name had finally been restored, not through argument or judgment, but through the simple honesty of his own words. Ranger rested peacefully beside Grace throughout the gathering, accepting gentle hands upon his shoulders from neighbors who now understood that the faithful German shepherd had done far more than guard an abandoned cabin. He had quietly protected one family's forgotten truth until an entire town was finally ready to hear it. The days that followed brought a quiet transformation no one in the mountain community had expected. News of Henry Mitchell's journal spread not through headlines or loud announcements, but through conversations. Shared over morning coffee, church gatherings, and neighbors meeting along snow-covered roads. Every person seemed to carry away the same lesson. A story repeated often enough could become accepted as truth, but only truth itself possessed the quiet strength to endure the passing of time. Grace Mitchell chose to remain in Pennsylvania longer than she had originally planned. Each morning she returned to the old cabin with Daniel Brooks and Ranger, determined to preserve the place that had protected her father's final gifts through more than 40 winters. Together they carefully swept away years of dust, repaired loose shutters, strengthened weathered porch boards, and polished the stone fireplace until it once again reflected warm afternoon light. Nothing was modernized beyond recognition. Every repair honored the cabin exactly as Henry had built it with his own hands. Ranger quietly accompanied them every day, moving peacefully from room to room as though watching over familiar memories rather than forgotten walls. The hidden compartment beneath the floor remained empty except for a small handwritten note placed there by Grace. It simply read, "The truth found its way home. Thank you for waiting." Daniel smiled when he saw the message. Some treasures no longer needed to be hidden once they had fulfilled their purpose. Before long, neighbors began arriving with quiet generosity. One family donated reclaimed cedar boards matching the original walls. Another brought handmade quilts stitched by local volunteers. An elderly carpenter spent several afternoons restoring the porch railing because he remembered helping Henry cut lumber many years earlier. Even children from the local school painted small wooden birdhouses that were placed among the surrounding pine trees, filling the once abandoned clearing with gentle signs of new life. No one asked for recognition. Everyone simply wanted to become part of restoring something they now understood had always deserved to be remembered with dignity. Grace decided that the cabin would never become a museum separated by glass or locked doors. Instead, it would remain a place where families could quietly visit, read Henry's carefully preserved journal through protected copies, and remember that love sometimes traveled farther than people realized. The original journal, the military medal, the family photographs, and the letter would remain safely preserved by the local historical society so future generations could learn the complete story without changing a single word Henry had written. One snowy afternoon, Daniel installed a simple wooden bench beneath the tallest pine overlooking the cabin. Grace placed a small bronze plaque upon it. It did not mention tragedy or loss. It carried only one sentence: "Some journeys end exactly where love has been waiting all along." Ranger wandered slowly through the clearing before stopping beside the bench. He looked toward the cabin one final time, then quietly rested beneath the pine tree as soft snowflakes drifted through the still air around him. Daniel noticed something that gently touched his heart. Since the day the truth reached Grace, Ranger had never once returned to the front door to keep watch. The faithful German shepherd no longer stared at the cabin with quiet expectation. He explored the woods, greeted every visitor with calm kindness, and rested peacefully whenever Grace or Daniel sat nearby. It was as though an invisible burden he had carried without complaint had finally become light enough to leave behind. Watching Ranger lying comfortably beneath the winter sky, Daniel understood that loyalty was never measured by how long someone waited. It was measured by refusing to give up until hope finally reached the people who needed it most. Winter slowly began loosening its quiet hold on the mountains as February gave way to the first gentle signs of spring. Snow still rested beneath the towering pines surrounding the cabin, yet narrow ribbons of clear water now flowed beneath melting ice, and the afternoon sun lingered a little longer across the peaceful valley each day. Daniel Brooks returned often, never because the cabin needed him, but because it had become one of the few places where silence felt complete instead of lonely. Ranger always accompanied him, walking comfortably along the familiar trail without rushing ahead or stopping before the front steps as he once had. The faithful German shepherd now greeted the cabin with the calm confidence of someone visiting an old friend rather than guarding an unfinished promise. Grace Mitchell remained in Pennsylvania throughout the changing season, determined to rebuild not only the cabin, but also the memories that had once seemed forever beyond her reach. Every weekend brought new visitors. Families arrived carrying homemade bread, fresh flowers, handwritten notes, and old photographs they had discovered inside forgotten boxes stored in attics and closets. Some remembered Henry Mitchell helping repair barns after heavy storms. Others recalled his quiet generosity during difficult winters when he delivered firewood to elderly neighbors without ever expecting thanks. Stories that had almost disappeared beneath years of misunderstanding slowly returned, one memory at a time, until a fuller picture of the man Grace had lost finally emerged. Daniel often watched her listening to each visitor with grateful attention, collecting every shared memory as though piecing together a family album that had been scattered by time. One bright Saturday morning, the local elementary school organized a small visit to the cabin. Children bundled in colorful winter coats listened quietly while Grace showed them copies of the journal and explained why kindness, patience, and truth should never be measured by how quickly they appeared. She never spoke about sadness. Instead, she told them that every person leaves behind something more valuable than possessions. They leave behind the way they choose to love others. Ranger became the unexpected center of every smile that morning. The children gently took turns brushing his thick black and tan coat, throwing soft snowballs for him to chase across the clearing, and reading aloud the simple message placed inside the restored hidden compartment beneath the floor. The truth found its way home. Their teacher quietly remarked that no history lesson had ever felt more alive. As afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall pine branches, Daniel noticed Ranger wandering toward the wooden bench overlooking the valley. The German shepherd climbed onto the small rise beside it and sat facing the distant mountains where the last patches of winter snow still gleamed beneath the blue sky. He remained there without moving, calm and completely at peace. Daniel joined him after several minutes, sitting quietly upon the bench while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the first signs of spring across the hillside. Neither man nor dog needed words. They had both witnessed something extraordinary, not because it had been impossible, but because it had been deeply human. Grace soon walked toward them carrying the restored family photograph that showed her father, little Dakota, and a smiling child standing outside the same cabin many winters before. She placed the photograph beside Daniel for a moment before looking toward Ranger. "He gave me back more than my father's story," she said softly. "He gave me the years I thought had been lost forever." Daniel gently rested one hand upon Ranger's broad shoulder while golden evening light essay. 1 year later, the first snowfall returned to the Pennsylvania mountains with the same quiet beauty that had begun an extraordinary journey, yet nothing about the forest felt lonely anymore. The old cabin stood proudly beneath fresh white snow, its cedar walls carefully restored, warm light glowing softly through its windows as families arrived throughout the day to remember a man whose true story had finally found its rightful place. Children laughed across the clearing while parents paused to read copies of Henry Mitchell's journal resting inside handcrafted wooden display cases. Fresh pine wreaths decorated the porch. The stone chimney released a thin ribbon of welcoming smoke into the crisp winter sky, and the small bronze plaque beside the wooden bench reflected the gentle afternoon sunlight that shimmered across the valley. Daniel Brooks parked his weathered truck in the same place where everything had begun 1 year earlier. He stepped into the familiar snow with a peaceful smile before opening the passenger door for Ranger. The German shepherd climbed down slowly, his thick black and tan coat glowing beneath the pale winter sun. Together they walked toward the cabin without hurry, leaving fresh footprints beside countless others that had crossed the clearing during the past year. Ranger paused only once beside the front porch where he had once kept his silent watch through endless snow. He looked toward the old doorway for several calm seconds before gently turning away on his own. Daniel noticed the quiet moment and understood its meaning without needing words. There was nothing left to guard. The promise had been fulfilled. Grace Mitchell soon stepped outside carrying a small basket filled with homemade bread that she now shared with every visitor who made the journey to the cabin. Her smile had become effortless, no longer shadowed by unanswered questions. She embraced Daniel warmly before kneeling beside Ranger, wrapping one arm around his neck with the same grateful affection she had shown from the very first day they met. "Welcome home," she whispered softly. This time she was not speaking to the cabin, to her father, or even to herself. She was speaking to the faithful companion whose quiet determination had changed every life standing there. As evening slowly settled across the mountains, neighbors gathered outside beneath strings of warm lanterns hanging between the tall pine trees. Eleanor Mitchell sat comfortably beneath a thick blanket beside the stone fire pit, smiling as children listened to Grace read one final passage from Henry's journal. No one hurried the moment. Snowflakes drifted gently through the golden firelight while laughter, quiet conversations, and grateful silence blended into something that felt almost sacred. Daniel looked across the clearing and realized that the cabin had become far more than a restored building. It had become a place where strangers left feeling like family because they remembered that every person carries a story no one else can fully see. Ranger wandered peacefully among the visitors, accepting gentle pats from children and warm smiles from neighbors before returning to Daniel's side, as though his work had finally become simple companionship once again. The veteran rested one hand upon the loyal dog's broad shoulder while they both looked toward the softly glowing cabin beneath the falling snow. Daniel thought back to the morning when he had first found Ranger refusing to leave this forgotten place. At the time, he believed he was trying to understand a dog's unusual behavior. Now he understood that loyalty sometimes speaks without sound, hope sometimes waits beneath silence, and love sometimes travels farther than any road can measure. The snow continued falling quietly across the mountains, covering yesterday's footprints while leaving tomorrow's path untouched. Somewhere beyond the peaceful forest, life continued as always. But here, where one faithful German shepherd had refused to walk away, an entire town had learned that truth may arrive slowly, yet when it finally reaches home, it has the power to heal hearts that never stopped waiting.